For over 40 years, Jeremiah had been telling the people of Judah exactly what they didn't want to hear, while other prophets stood in the royal court promising victory and prosperity. Jeremiah walked the streets of Jerusalem screaming about coming destruction, while priests assured the king that God would never let his holy temple fall. Jeremiah prophesied that Babylon would burn it to the ground, while false prophets told desperate people what they wanted to believe. Jeremiah delivered the truth that would get him marked for death. This wasn't just an unpopular message, it was treason. The kingdom of Judah in the late 7th century BCE existed in a geopolitical nightmare, crushed between two superpowers, Egypt to the south and the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire to the north. Every political decision was a gamble that could either save the nation or destroy it, and Jeremiah's constant message to surrender to Babylon, to accept vassalage, to stop resisting. This wasn't prophecy to the authorities, it was collaboration with the enemy. The system of prophecy in ancient Judah wasn't like modern religious preaching. It was a competitive marketplace of political influence where multiple prophets claimed divine authority for opposing positions. You had court prophets who told kings what they wanted to hear, securing royal patronage and comfortable positions. You had independent prophets like Jeremiah who operated outside the power structure. And you had opportunists who called themselves prophets to advance their own agendas. The problem was that everyone claimed to speak for God, and there was no objective way to verify who was telling the truth until their predictions came true or failed. Jeremiah had been at this since around 627 BCE, called to prophetic service as a young man, possibly still in his 20s. For decades he watched as king after king made catastrophic decisions. He saw Josiah die needlessly in battle against Egypt. He witnessed Jehoiakim's foolish rebellion against Babylon. He watched as his own people dismissed every warning, mocked every prophecy, and doubled down on the political strategies that were guaranteed to bring destruction. By the time Jerusalem faced its final siege in 588 BCE, Jeremiah was probably in his 60s, an old man who had spent his entire adult life being right about everything while everyone treated him like he was insane. The worst part wasn't just that people disagreed with him, it was the active, sustained campaign to silence him. Prophets like Hananiah publicly contradicted Jeremiah's messages, promising that Babylon's power would be broken within 2 years. Priests like Pasha had Jeremiah beaten and locked in stocks for public humiliation. Royal officials wanted him executed as a traitor. Even Jeremiah's own family from his hometown of Anathoth turned against him, plotting to kill him because his prophecies brought shame on their community. During those final years before Jerusalem's fall, as Babylonian armies assembled for what everyone knew would be the decisive siege, Jeremiah's message became more desperate and more explicit. Stop fighting. Surrender. Anyone who stays in this city will die by sword, famine, or plague. Anyone who surrenders to the Babylonians will live. The city will be burned. The temple will be destroyed. Everything you're trying to save by fighting will be lost precisely because you're fighting. To the people of Jerusalem, this was the ultimate betrayal. The temple was supposed to be inviolable, God's dwelling place on earth. The Davidic monarchy was supposed to be eternal, guaranteed by divine covenant. Jerusalem was the holy city, protected by God himself. And here was Jeremiah, claiming to speak for that same God, saying it would all be destroyed. It was blasphemy. It was treason. It was psychological warfare that weakened public morale during a national emergency. By 588 BCE, with Babylonian forces surrounding Jerusalem, the city's leadership had heard enough. Jeremiah's message wasn't just unpopular anymore, it was dangerous. Soldiers, hearing that resistance was futile, were beginning to believe him. Civilians were considering surrender. The entire defensive strategy relied on maintaining hope that God would intervene, that reinforcements from Egypt might arrive, that somehow Jerusalem would survive as it had survived the Assyrian siege a century earlier. Jeremiah's constant prophecies of inevitable doom were undermining everything the city's leaders were trying to accomplish, so they decided to silence him permanently. Not with a quick execution that might make him a martyr, not with exile that might let him spread his message elsewhere. They chose something slower, crueler, and designed to break him completely before he died. They would throw him into a cistern and let him sink into the mud at the bottom, where he would slowly suffocate or starve, forgotten in the darkness while the city fought for its survival above. But wait, it gets worse. The cistern of Mulcasia, located in the courtyard of the guard, wasn't designed as a prison. It was a water reservoir, one of hundreds carved into the limestone bedrock beneath Jerusalem to collect and store rainwater. During Jerusalem's dry seasons, these cisterns were lifelines. But this one had run dry during the siege, its water supplies exhausted by the desperate population packed inside the city walls. What remained at the bottom was several feet of thick glutinous mud, a mixture of sediment, organic waste, and stagnant moisture that had accumulated over years. When the royal officials came for Jeremiah in 587 BCE, probably in the summer as Babylonian siege engines pounded Jerusalem's walls, they weren't subtle about what they intended. They went directly to King Zedekiah with their accusation. This man is weakening the hands of the soldiers who are left in this city, and the hands of all the people, by speaking such words to them. He is not seeking the good of these people but their ruin. In a city under siege, with food running out and enemy forces surrounding every gate, that accusation was a death sentence. Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, was in an impossible position. He was a Babylonian puppet, placed on the throne after Nebuchadnezzar had deported the previous king and thousands of Judah's elite in 597 BCE. His entire reign was based on maintaining an impossible balance, keeping Babylon satisfied while retaining enough independence to be taken seriously by his own people. He'd made the catastrophic decision to rebel, gambling that Egyptian support would tip the scales. Now Jerusalem was paying the price, and his authority was crumbling along with his city's walls. When his officials demanded Jeremiah's execution, Zedekiah gave them the weakest response imaginable. "He is in your hands. The king can do nothing to oppose you." This wasn't mercy, it was cowardice. Zedekiah was washing his hands of the prophet's blood while giving implicit permission for murder. The officials knew exactly what to do with that authorization. They took ropes, bound Jeremiah, and lowered him into Malchijah's cistern. The cistern's opening was narrow, designed to minimize evaporation and contamination. Getting a full-grown man through it required careful maneuvering, especially one who was probably in his 60s and had already endured previous imprisonments that had weakened his body. The descent into darkness must have been terrifying. Jeremiah would have felt the temperature drop as he was lowered deeper into the earth, the walls pressing in around him, the smell of stagnant water and decay intensifying with every foot of rope that played out. Then his feet touched bottom, except there was no solid bottom. He sank immediately into mud that came up to his thighs, possibly higher. The officials pulled up the ropes and left him there in complete darkness. Archaeological excavations of similar cisterns from this period in Jerusalem revealed just how horrific this imprisonment was. These weren't shallow pools. Many were 20 to 30 feet deep, carved straight down into solid rock with smooth, unclimbable walls. The mud at the bottom would have been cold, dense, and suffocating. Every slight movement would cause Jeremiah to sink deeper. Trying to sit down meant the mud would creep up his torso. Lying down was impossible without the mud covering his face. His only option was to stand, hour after hour, fighting exhaustion and the constant pull of the mud, knowing that when his legs finally gave out, he would drown in filth in absolute darkness. There was no food, no water, except whatever moisture he could squeeze from the mud itself, contaminated with who knows what decay. No light, which meant no sense of time passing. No way to know if it was day or night, if hours or days had passed. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical suffering. Jeremiah had spent over 40 years warning Jerusalem about this moment, and now he was going to die in a hole in the ground, silenced and forgotten while the city collapsed around him exactly as he'd predicted. The officials had calculated this perfectly. They couldn't execute Jeremiah openly without risking backlash from those who still believed he might be a true prophet. But if he died slowly in a cistern, technically from natural causes after being imprisoned for weakening public morale during wartime, well, that was unfortunate but necessary. By the time anyone found his body, the question of who was right about Jerusalem's fate would already be answered, and dead prophets can't say "I told you so." But there was one person in Jerusalem who couldn't stomach this cruelty. Ebed-Melech was an Ethiopian, a court official serving in King Zedekiah's palace. Why an African was serving in the Judahite court isn't entirely clear from historical records, but it wasn't unusual for ancient Near Eastern kingdoms to employ foreigners in administrative positions. What was unusual was that this foreigner, this outsider to Jewish society and politics, was the only person in the entire royal court willing to risk his position to save the prophet. Ebed-Melech went directly to Zedekiah, who was sitting in the Benjamin Gate, probably conducting the daily business of managing the siege. "My lord the king, these men have acted wickedly in all they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. They have thrown him into a cistern, where he will starve to death when there is no longer any bread in the city." It was a brilliant argument. Ebed-Melech wasn't challenging the king's authority or questioning the officials' right to imprison Jeremiah. He was simply pointing out that they'd gone too far, that letting a prophet starve to death in a cistern would be a stain on Zedekiah's reign, and that if they were going to hold him prisoner, they should at least do it somewhere he could survive. Zedekiah agreed immediately, probably relieved to have a way out of the situation that didn't require him to directly confront his officials. "Take 30 men from here with you and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." 30 men seems excessive for a rescue operation until you realize that Zedekiah was protecting Ebed-Melech from potential retaliation by the officials who'd put Jeremiah in the cistern in the first place. The message was clear: this rescue has royal authorization, and anyone who interferes will answer to 30 armed guards. Ebed-Melech went to work with remarkable compassion. He didn't just grab ropes and haul Jeremiah out like cargo. He went to the palace wardrobe and gathered old rags and worn-out clothes. Then he lowered them down to Jeremiah with the ropes, calling down instructions. "Put these old rags and worn-out clothes under your arms to pad the ropes." Even in this moment of rescue, Ebed-Melech was thinking about Jeremiah's suffering, about how rough ropes cutting into the armpits of an exhausted, mud-covered old man would cause additional agony. They pulled him up slowly, carefully, until he emerged from the darkness into blinding sunlight, covered in filth, barely able to stand, but alive. Jeremiah was returned to the courtyard of the guard, still a prisoner, but at least in a location where he could breathe clean air, receive food and water, and survive until Jerusalem's final crisis arrived. The rescue was a temporary reprieve, nothing more. The officials who'd tried to kill Jeremiah were still in power. The siege was intensifying. Food supplies were running out. Disease was spreading through the overcrowded city. And every one of Jeremiah's prophecies about Jerusalem's fate was approaching its fulfillment with mathematical precision. The prophet who'd spent decades warning about this moment would now have to watch as his worst nightmares became reality. And unlike the darkness of the cistern, he wouldn't be able to look away from any of it. But wait. The fall of Jerusalem would bring horrors that made the cistern look merciful. In July of 587 BCE, the walls of Jerusalem finally broke. After 18 months of relentless siege, starvation, and disease, the Babylonian battering rams found their weak point. Nebuchadnezzar's forces poured through the breach in the northern wall. And what followed was the methodical destruction of everything the kingdom of Judah had built over for centuries. Jeremiah witnessed it all from the courtyard of the guard where he remained imprisoned. He heard the screams as Babylonian soldiers swept through the streets. He smelled the smoke as buildings burned throughout the city. He watched as desperate civilians tried to flee through any opening they could find, only to be cut down or captured by enemy forces that had surrounded every exit. The siege had already killed thousands through starvation and plague. The actual assault added thousands more to the death toll in a matter of hours. King Zedekiah tried to escape under cover of darkness with his remaining military forces. They made it as far as the plains of Jericho before Babylonian cavalry ran them down. What happened next was designed to be the final, brutal lesson about the cost of rebellion against Babylon. Zedekiah was dragged back and brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, the Babylonian military headquarters in Syria. There, Zedekiah was forced to watch as his sons were executed in front of him, the royal line of David cut down before his eyes. Then the Babylonians blinded him, ensuring that the last thing he would ever see was his children's murder. Zedekiah was bound in bronze chains and taken to Babylon, where he would die in prison, a broken puppet king who gambled his kingdom on Egyptian promises that never materialized. The Babylonians were methodical in their destruction of Jerusalem. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated policy designed to ensure Judah would never rebel again. 1 month after the breach, in August 587 BCE, Nebuzaradan, the commander of the imperial guard, arrived with specific orders: burn the temple, destroy the royal palace, tear down the city walls, deport everyone useful, leave only the poorest peasants to work the land. The destruction of Solomon's temple was particularly devastating. This wasn't just a religious building, it was the physical manifestation of God's presence among his people, the center of Jewish identity, the guarantee that the covenant between God and Israel remained intact. It had stood for over 360 years, surviving Assyrian invasions, political upheavals, and religious reforms. Now Babylonian soldiers systematically stripped it of everything valuable: the gold, the silver, the bronze pillars, the sacred vessels used in worship. Then they set it on fire. Archaeological evidence from excavations in Jerusalem confirms the scale of destruction. Layers of ash and burned debris from this period covered the ancient city. Babylonian arrowheads had been found embedded in walls. The devastation was so complete that it took over 140 years before anything resembling a functioning city would exist on the site again. Pottery from the period simply stops appearing in the archaeological record, evidence of how thoroughly the population was removed or killed. The deportations were selective and brutal. Nebuzaradan identified everyone who might pose a threat or prove useful to Babylon: the priests, the officials, the artisans, the warriors, anyone with skills or influence. These were the people who would be forcibly relocated to Babylonian territories, their expertise put to use building and maintaining the empire's infrastructure. The total number deported in this final wave was probably several thousand, added to the 10,000 already taken in the first deportation a decade earlier, but Jeremiah wasn't among them. When Nebuzaradan was going through lists of prisoners to be deported, he had specific orders regarding the prophet. Nebuchadnezzar himself had apparently heard about Jeremiah, the man who'd been telling Jerusalem to surrender for decades, who'd been imprisoned as a traitor by his own people for delivering the exact message Babylon wanted everyone to hear. The irony was perfect. The prophet Judah had tried to silence as a collaborator was now being rewarded by the conquerors he'd supposedly been helping. Nebuzaradan had Jeremiah released from the courtyard of the guard and brought before him. The Babylonian commander gave him an offer that must have been surreal after everything Jeremiah had endured. "Come with me to Babylon, and I will look after you well, or stay here in Judah if you prefer. The whole country is before you. Go wherever you want." The man who'd spent decades as a prisoner of his own people was being given freedom and protection by their destroyers. Jeremiah made his choice quickly. He would stay in Judah with Gedaliah son of Ahikam, whom the Babylonians had appointed as governor over the remaining population. Nebuzaradan provided him with provisions and a gift, then let him go. For the first time in years, Jeremiah was free to move through what remained of his homeland without chains. without guards, without the constant threat of assassination by his own countrymen. But freedom in a destroyed nation felt nothing like victory. Jerusalem was a smoking ruin. The temple was gone. The walls were rubble. Bodies were everywhere, too many to bury properly. The stench of death hung over the city. The survivors, mostly the poor who had nothing worth stealing, wandered through the devastation in shock, trying to comprehend how completely their world had ended. Gedaliah set up his administration in Mizpah, a town about 8 miles north of Jerusalem that hadn't been completely destroyed. His mission was nearly impossible: maintain order among the traumatized survivors, collect enough agricultural output to satisfy Babylonian tribute demands, prevent further rebellions, and somehow rebuild some semblance of society from the ashes. Jeremiah joined him there, presumably to offer counsel and religious guidance to the remnant population. For a few brief months, it almost seemed like Gedaliah might succeed. Some of the Judahite military leaders who had fled into the countryside came to Mizpah and pledged their support. Refugees who had escaped to surrounding territories began returning when they heard that Babylon was allowing a limited restoration under Gedaliah's governance. There was talk of planting crops, rebuilding homes, establishing new patterns of life in the ruins of the Old Kingdom. Archaeological evidence supports this brief period of attempted recovery. Ceilings have been found inscribed with belonging to Gedaliah, who was over the house, confirming his administrative role. Storage jars from the period suggest some level of agricultural production was resuming. For survivors who had expected total annihilation, this limited autonomy under Babylonian oversight must have felt like an unexpected gift. But not everyone was ready to accept the new reality. There were men who saw Gedaliah's cooperation with Babylon as collaboration, who viewed his governorship as illegitimate precisely because it was granted by foreign conquerors. These men still believed in the possibility of continued resistance, of maintaining the dream of an independent Judah even after everything they'd already lost, and some of them were willing to commit murder to prevent what they saw as the final surrender of their national identity. Gedaliah received multiple warnings that Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, a member of the royal family, was planning to assassinate him. The warnings came from people who had no reason to lie, who had seen evidence of the conspiracy, who knew that Balis, the king of Ammon, was supporting the plot as part of his own resistance to Babylonian domination. But Gedaliah refused to believe it. He couldn't accept that fellow Judahites would sabotage the fragile recovery he was attempting to build, that anyone would be foolish enough to murder the one person Babylon had entrusted with their survival. He was wrong, and his refusal to take the threat seriously would unleash a catastrophe that made even Jerusalem's fall seem like the beginning rather than the end of Judah's suffering. In the 7th month of 586 BCE, just weeks after the destruction of Jerusalem, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, arrived in Mizpah with 10 men. They came during the harvest season, when Gedaliah was hosting a meal, probably a gathering meant to demonstrate that normal life could resume even after national catastrophe. Ishmael and his men sat down to eat with Gedaliah, shared his bread, accepted his hospitality. Then they murdered him. The assassination was swift and brutal. Ishmael and his men killed Gedaliah, the Judahite officials who were with him, and the Babylonian soldiers stationed in Mizpah as part of the occupation force. This wasn't just murder, it was a declaration of renewed rebellion, a deliberate provocation designed to signal that some Judahites would never accept Babylonian rule, no matter what it cost. But Ishmael wasn't finished. The next day, before news of the assassination had spread, 80 men arrived from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, pilgrims traveling to the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem to offer grain offerings and incense despite its destruction. These were devout men, many of them with their beards shaved and clothes torn in traditional signs of mourning, coming to mourn at the site where God's house had stood. Ishmael went out to meet them, weeping as if in shared grief, and invited them to come see God. When they entered the town, Ishmael and his men slaughtered them and threw their bodies into a cistern. 70 men died for no reason except that they were witnesses to the massacre at Mizpah. 10 survived by revealing that they had hidden stores of wheat, barley, olive oil, and honey in the fields. Ishmael spared them long enough to seize their supplies, then took the remaining population of Mizpah as captives, including the king's daughters, who had been entrusted to Gedaliah's protection. He set out toward Ammon, apparently planning to find refuge with King Balis, who had supported the assassination. When Johanan, son of Kareah, and the other military commanders who had pledged support to Gedaliah heard what Ishmael had done, they assembled their forces and pursued him. They caught up with Ishmael at the Great Pool in Gibeon. Most of the captives managed to break free and join Johanan's forces during the confrontation. But Ishmael and 8 of his men escaped and made it to Ammon, leaving behind a massacre that had accomplished nothing except guaranteeing Babylonian retaliation. Johanan and the surviving leaders now faced an impossible situation. They had just witnessed the assassination of the governor Babylon had appointed. Babylonian soldiers had been killed. From the Babylonian perspective, this would look like Judah rebelling again, and the standard imperial response to rebellion was total annihilation. Everyone who remained in Judah was now living under a death sentence, waiting for Babylonian armies to return and finish what Ishmael's stupidity had started. There was only one option that seemed remotely safe: Egypt. The southern border was relatively close, Egypt had been Babylon's rival throughout this entire conflict. Maybe Pharaoh would grant asylum to the refugees fleeing Babylonian retribution. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan that didn't involve sitting in Judah waiting to be slaughtered. But before they fled, the leaders decided to consult Jeremiah, the prophet who had survived the cistern, who had watched Jerusalem fall exactly as he'd predicted, who had been right about literally everything for 40 years. Surely he could tell them what God wanted them to do now. They gathered near Bethlehem, a day's journey from the Egyptian border, and made Jeremiah an offer that sounded sincere. Pray to the Lord your God for this entire remnant. Ask him whether we should go to Egypt or stay here. Whatever he tells you, we will do it, we promise. Whether it's favorable or unfavorable, we will obey. Jeremiah agreed. 10 days later, he returned with God's answer, and it was unambiguous. Do not go to Egypt. Stay in Judah. I will build you up and plant you, not tear you down. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon. I will save you from his hand. He will have compassion on you and restore you to your land. But if you disobey and go to Egypt, the sword you fear will overtake you there, and the famine you dread will follow you to Egypt. You will die there. The message was clear, and it was consistent with everything Jeremiah had been saying for decades. Trust God's protection rather than your own schemes. Don't run to Egypt for safety. The political alliances and military calculations that seemed like wisdom were actually paths to destruction. Stay where you are, accept what has happened, and rebuild from the ruins. It was the same core message Jeremiah had delivered before Jerusalem fell, just adapted to the new crisis. The leaders' response revealed that their promise to obey had been a lie from the beginning. You are lying, they told Jeremiah. The Lord our God has not sent you to say we must not go to Egypt. Baruch son of Neriah is inciting you against us to hand us over to the Babylonians, so they may kill us or carry us into exile to Babylon. They had asked for prophecy, but only if it confirmed what they'd already decided to do. When Jeremiah delivered a message they didn't want to hear, they simply accused him of conspiracy and ignored him. So Johanan and the military leaders gathered the entire remnant, every survivor of the massacres and deportations, and forced them to go to Egypt, and they took Jeremiah with them. The prophet who had spent his entire adult life warning Judah not to trust in Egyptian alliances, who had been imprisoned for saying Jerusalem would fall to Babylon, who had watched every one of his prophecies come true while his people ignored him, was now being physically dragged to Egypt against his will by the very people who had promised to obey whatever God told them. They ended up in Tahpanhes, a frontier city in the eastern Nile Delta, probably one of several locations where Pharaoh allowed refugee communities to settle. Archaeological excavations at Tel Dafana have confirmed this was an important Egyptian military and administrative center during this period. For the Jewish refugees, it must have seemed like salvation, a place far enough from Babylon's reach where they might rebuild their shattered lives in safety. But for Jeremiah, it was exile in the land he'd spent decades warning his people to avoid. He was now trapped among refugees who blamed him for their suffering, who resented his prophecies, who were determined to prove that their own judgment was better than God's explicit commands. And in this foreign land, surrounded by Egyptian gods and desperate angry survivors of national catastrophe, Jeremiah would deliver his final recorded messages. Messages that would be met with the most complete rejection he'd ever experienced. The prophet who survived the cistern, who witnessed Jerusalem's fall, who endured imprisonment and assassination attempts, was about to discover that sometimes the worst fate isn't death. Sometimes it's being forced to watch as the people you tried to save make the exact same mistakes that destroyed them in the first place, and being powerless to stop them. The Jewish refugee community in Egypt had learned nothing. After watching their nation destroyed, their temple burned, their families slaughtered or deported, after experiencing firsthand the catastrophic consequences of ignoring prophetic warnings for decades, they arrived in Egypt and immediately resumed the exact religious practices that Jeremiah had been condemning since the beginning of his ministry. They were worshipping the Queen of Heaven. The identity of this deity isn't completely certain from historical records, but she was most likely Ishtar or Astarte, ancient Near Eastern goddesses of fertility, love, and war who were worshipped throughout the region. These weren't minor household shrines or secret practices. This was open communal worship involving entire families. The women baked cakes marked with the goddess's image. The men gathered wood and built fires for offerings. Children helped prepare the ritual meals. It was normalized, institutionalized idolatry that had been part of Judahite religious life for generations despite repeated prophetic condemnations. When Jeremiah confronted them about this, the community's response was stunning in its defiance. We will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. Instead, we will do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. But it wasn't just defiance. It was a complete inversion of Jeremiah's entire theological framework. They had developed their own explanation for why Jerusalem fell, and it had nothing to do with covenant unfaithfulness or divine judgment. Listen to their reasoning. At that time we had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm, but ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, We have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine. In their minds, the causation ran exactly opposite to what Jeremiah had been preaching. They believed Jerusalem's destruction happened because they had listened to reformers like Jeremiah's patron, King Josiah, who had suppressed the worship of other deities. When Josiah destroyed the high places and purged foreign religious practices in his reforms around 622 BCE, the community saw it as abandoning the goddess who had protected them. The subsequent disasters, Josiah's death in battle, the Babylonian invasions, the fall of Jerusalem, all of this was the Queen of Heaven's punishment for neglecting her worship. This wasn't just theological disagreement. It was a fundamental rejection of everything Jeremiah represented. For over 40 years, it proclaimed that Judah's suffering came from breaking their covenant with the God of Israel, from worshipping foreign deities, from trusting in political alliances instead of divine promises. The community's response was essentially, "You're wrong. You've always been wrong. Our suffering came from listening to people like you." The women were particularly vocal in their defense of the Queen of Heaven cult. "When we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did not our husbands know that we were making cakes impressed with her image and pouring out drink offerings to her?" They were pointing out that this wasn't secret female rebellion. The men had participated, the officials had participated, even the kings had participated. This was mainstream Judahite religion, and the reformers who tried to suppress it were the radicals, not them. Jeremiah's final recorded sermon in response is a masterpiece of frustrated prophecy. He told them they would get exactly what they wanted. "Fine," he said. "Keep your vows to the Queen of Heaven. Fulfill your promises to her. But know this, God swears that his name will no longer be invoked by any Judahite in Egypt. None of you will live to return to Judah, except a few fugitives. Then you will know whose word stands, mine or yours." He prophesied that Pharaoh Hophra, the Egyptian king they were counting on for protection, would be handed over to his enemies just as Zedekiah had been handed over to Nebuchadnezzar. Egypt wouldn't be the safe haven they imagined. The sword and famine they thought they'd escaped by leaving Judah would find them even here, and ultimately, they would learn the hard way that the Queen of Heaven couldn't save them any more than she'd saved Jerusalem. It was Jeremiah's final documented confrontation. His last recorded prophecy, delivered to a community that had completely rejected his authority and his message. He wasn't just losing an argument, he was watching the destruction of prophetic legitimacy itself. If the people could witness the exact fulfillment of 40 years of prophecies and still conclude that the prophet was wrong, what was the point of prophecy at all? The community in Tahpanhes wasn't just dispersed refugees. Historical evidence suggests there were substantial Jewish populations in multiple Egyptian locations during this period. The Elephantine papyri discovered in the 20th century and dating from roughly a century after Jeremiah's time document a Jewish military colony on an island in the Nile that had its own temple and practiced a form of Judaism that included worship of other deities alongside the God of Israel. This wasn't a temporary aberration. It was a long-term pattern of syncretistic religion that persisted for generations. So Jeremiah found himself trapped in a community that had created an alternative theological narrative, one that placed him as the villain rather than the prophet. In their story, he was the one who had led Judah astray by supporting reforms that angered the Queen of Heaven. His prophecies of doom had been self-fulfilling curses rather than divine warnings. His survival when so many died was suspicious, possibly evidence that he'd been working with the Babylonians all along, just as they'd accused him during the siege. The psychological torture of this situation is almost unimaginable. Jeremiah had been right about everything. Every prediction had come true exactly as he'd said. The fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the Babylonian victory, the exile, everything he'd spent decades warning about had happened precisely according to his prophecies, and it made no difference. The community had simply rewritten the narrative to make their own choices correct and his warnings wrong. This is where the biblical text ends its account of Jeremiah's life. Chapter 44 concludes with his prophecy against the Egyptian Jewish community, and then silence. No description of his death, no account of his final days, no record of whether anyone ever acknowledged he'd been right. The prophet who had been such a detailed chronicler of his nation's destruction simply disappears from the historical record, his voice silenced among refugees who refused to listen. But centuries later, traditions emerged about how Jeremiah's story ended, and those traditions are as brutal as everything else in his life. Here's what we know for certain. Jeremiah died in Egypt. The biblical text never mentions him again after his confrontation with the refugee community in Tahpanhes. He doesn't appear in any contemporary Babylonian records. He's not mentioned in the later accounts of the return from exile. For a figure who dominated the historical narrative for over 40 years, his ending is marked by complete documentary silence. But absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, and later Jewish traditions filled in the gap with a story that makes horrifying sense given everything we know about Jeremiah's relationship with his own people. According to the Lives of the Prophets, a text compiled in the 1st century CE, roughly 600 years after the events it describes, Jeremiah was stoned to death by the Jewish community in Tahpanhes. The reason given, he wouldn't stop rebuking them for their idolatry. The tradition appears in multiple later sources with consistent details. After his final confrontation over the Queen of Heaven worship, Jeremiah continued to preach against the community's religious practices. The refugees, already hostile and convinced he was responsible for their suffering, finally decided they'd heard enough. They picked up stones and killed him, the traditional method of execution for blasphemy in Jewish law, now being used against the prophet himself. We have to be absolutely clear about the historical reliability of this tradition. It comes from sources written centuries after Jeremiah's death, compiled by communities that had their own theological agendas and reasons to create martyrdom narratives for ancient prophets. There's no contemporary documentation, no archaeological evidence, no corroboration from the biblical text itself. By historical standards, this is tradition, not verified fact. But here's what makes the tradition plausible. It fits the pattern perfectly. Jeremiah had been threatened with death multiple times during his ministry. In his hometown of Anathoth, his own relatives plotted to kill him. In Jerusalem, priests and prophets tried to have him executed for prophesying against the temple. Officials threw him in a cistern to die. The only reason he survived as long as he did was because of occasional intervention by people like Ebed-Melech, or the momentary protection of Babylonian authority after Jerusalem fell. In Egypt, he had no protection. The Babylonians weren't there to preserve him as a useful voice. The Egyptian authorities had no stake in protecting a foreign prophet who was causing trouble in their refugee communities, and the Jewish refugees themselves saw him as the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. He represented a theology that blamed them for their suffering, a message that demanded they abandon the religious practices they believed would restore their prosperity, and a prophetic authority that made them feel judged for simply trying to survive. The method of execution would have been communal. Stoning wasn't an individual act of violence, it was corporate judgment where the entire community participated in carrying out the sentence. Everyone picked up stones, everyone threw. The guilt and responsibility were distributed across the whole group, ensuring that no single person could be blamed. For a community that had already rejected Jeremiah's authority and created their own narrative about why Jerusalem fell, stoning the prophet who wouldn't stop condemning them would have been the final act of theological defiance. Some later traditions add that Jeremiah was buried in Egypt, near the place where Pharaoh's palace stood. Others claim his body was eventually returned to Jerusalem by Jewish pilgrims. These details proliferate in medieval rabbinic literature, each generation adding layers to the story, creating a mythology around the prophet's end that may have little connection to historical reality. What we can say with confidence is this: Jeremiah died far from home, among people who hated him, without ever seeing the restoration he'd prophesied would eventually come. He spent his entire adult life being rejected by the people he was trying to save. His message was ignored, his warnings dismissed, his suffering mocked. When his prophecies came true exactly as he'd said, it didn't vindicate him. It just made people angrier, because nobody likes being told "I told you so" by the prophet they'd thrown in a cistern. The horrible irony of Jeremiah's life is that he was right about absolutely everything and it accomplished nothing. Jerusalem fell exactly as he predicted. The temple burned exactly as he warned. The exile happened exactly as he described. The refugees who fled to Egypt against his explicit instructions probably did face the sword and famine he prophesied, though we don't have detailed records of what happened to them. Every single prediction came true, and it made no difference to the people he was trying to reach. This is the dark reality of prophetic ministry that religious tradition often sanitizes. Jeremiah didn't die peacefully in his sleep, respected and honored by a grateful nation. He didn't live to see the return from exile or the rebuilding of the temple. He died as he lived, rejected and persecuted by the very people whose destruction he tried to prevent. The prophet whose mission was to warn Jerusalem about the consequences of its choices became the scapegoat for those consequences, blamed for the disaster he'd predicted, rather than credited with trying to prevent it. Modern archaeology and historical analysis have confirmed remarkable details about the period Jeremiah lived through. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem is documented in multiple sources. The destruction layers in Jerusalem match the biblical timeline. Seals and inscriptions confirm the names of officials mentioned in Jeremiah's account. The geopolitical situation, caught between Babylon and Egypt, is verified by external records. In other words, the historical context of Jeremiah's prophecies has been validated by evidence outside the biblical text itself. But validation came centuries too late to matter to Jeremiah personally. He lived in the moment when being right looked indistinguishable from being a traitor, when warning about disaster made you responsible for it, when speaking truth made you the enemy. And he died, most likely, being punished for refusing to stop telling a truth that nobody wanted to hear. The final cruelty is that Jeremiah's death, unlike his life, went unrecorded by the scribes who had documented his every prophecy and persecution for decades. The book that bears his name chronicles his suffering in extraordinary detail, preserving his laments, his prison experiences, his confrontations with kings and officials. But it falls silent at the end, as if even his own supporters couldn't bear to document how it finally ended for the prophet who had been right about everything. So we're left with silence interrupted by later tradition. centuries of distance between event and record, and the strong suspicion that the man who spent 40 years warning about destruction died violently at the hands of people who blamed him for failing to prevent it. Jeremiah's legacy is the book that survived him, copied and preserved by communities that eventually recognized his prophecies had been accurate. But the man himself disappeared into Egypt, his voice silenced, his warnings proven correct but useless, his life a testament to the brutal cost of speaking truth to people determined not to hear it. In the end, the prophet who documented his nation's destruction couldn't even control the documentation of his own death. And maybe that's the most fitting conclusion for a man whose entire ministry was defined by being ignored. Even in death, Jeremiah remained what he'd always been, a voice crying out in the wilderness, speaking truth that nobody wanted to accept, warning about consequences that people refused to believe until it was too late to change them. His final days weren't heroic, they were horrific. Trapped among refugees who hated him, in a foreign land he'd begged them not to enter, delivering messages that fell on ears that had been deaf for 40 years, and probably dying at the hands of the very community he'd spent his life trying to save. If the tradition of his stoning is accurate, his last moments would have been looking up at the faces of people he'd known for decades, watching them pick up stones, knowing that even now, even at the end, they still believed he was the enemy rather than the prophet who'd tried to warn them. The horrific final days of Jeremiah weren't just about his death. They were about the complete failure of his life's work, the absolute rejection of his message, and the bitter realization that sometimes truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just gets you killed by people who prefer comfortable lies.